All right, welcome back, everybody. Hope you guys got a nice lunch. And we have Andrew and Anthony here to talk about C2 evasion. Let's see. What else? Well, without further ado, please give a nice warm round of applause for Andrew and Anthony.
All right, let's kick this off.
Yeah. You want to lead off? Yeah, sure. Okay. Hi guys, thanks for coming. I'm really glad at the turnout because I figured after lunch people would like go and take naps or answer emails or something. So glad to see you all come. Thank you. Today we're going to be talking a bit about evading C2 detection with asymmetry. My name is Andrew Johnston.
And my name's Anthony Motto. And yeah. So well.
We'll pass back and forth. So. During the day, I work as a proactive cybersecurity consultant for Mandiant. So basically, I break into a bunch of different networks. I also am a lead researcher at Fordham University, where I'm looking at using AI to fight terrorism online.
And I am also a student at Fordham University, undergraduate, about to graduate. Woo. I'm currently sleep deprived, and I also do the research that he just mentioned. So I sort of manage the sort of AI development at the lab. He's sort of the brains operation. I'm kind of maybe the brawn. I don't really know what I'd be, but he tells me what to do and I do it. And it's a relationship that works out pretty well.
So before we begin, we have to give the standard disclaimers. So if you want to use this information to commit crimes, that's on you. We're not advocating for that. And anything we say up here, that's our opinion. Please don't hold Fordham or Mandiant or anyone else against to it. And I'm not going to read that long blurb because there are way too many words. But essentially, anything we talk about today, we're not telling stories from a specific client, and this is more the amalgamation of our experience rather than a specific reference. So if you're a client of Mandiant or if you're interested in becoming one, we're not calling anyone out. This is just what we've seen.
All right, so why are we here? Well, your malware is bad and you should feel bad. No, I'm kidding. But basically, I mean, we're going to go over the sort of what's currently out there type of thing. And what we have right now is, your basic beaconing malware that is convenient to use, but it's, it's very noisy.
And so you're probably familiar with the standard techniques. If you're setting up a C2 server, you probably register a nice sounding domain name. You probably go to one of the categorization services and try to get it in there. But this is really a cat and mouse. This is not a game we want to be playing because for everything that we do as red teamers, the blue teamers are quick to pick up on it and to come up with countermeasures. So wouldn't it be a lot nicer if we could make malware that just looked like normal activity? Sure. So the first kind of shells, right, the early C2 servers, it's stuff like you see in Metasploit. It's bind shells, it's reverse shells. We call these synchronous, right? It's one long session, and they're nice because everything's really fast. If you send out a command, you get the results as soon as it's done. And it's really easy to set up. There's a bunch of different support for them across different frameworks. But they're far from perfect. For starters, you have this domain categorization problem, and you have to do a lot to make it look normal, but that becomes really hard because the longer these sessions last, the more they're gonna raise some eyebrows on the blue team, right? If if there's some workstation that's had a connection to a host for 27 hours, that's gonna make someone say, why is that? And that's not a place where we want to be.
And, the next step you can go from there is what you'd call asynchronous shells like Empire and Cobalt Strike. They're less frequent connections over HTTPS. You can sort of like put them onto the host and, you can have them send stuff back to you at a certain set amount of time, be that 5 seconds, maybe an hour, maybe a day. It's slower, but, the pros of that is that it ends up being less noisy. There's a lot less network traffic for one. And you can also do things, clever things like limit the network traffic to times in which there's actual business going on. You don't want sending something back at like 3 a.m. Like who's working at 3 a.m. That seems pretty suspicious.
Yeah, and these beacons are still they're not perfect. They are a lot better than what Metasploit will give you out of the box. But even if you have a good domain and it's categorized, it's still new, or at least new-ish. And if you're a defender, if you're really monitoring your network and trying to look for anomalous traffic, and all of a sudden you see a website that you've never seen before, and there's 50 people who are all connecting to it almost 6,000 times a day, which is about 8 hours at, checking in every 5 seconds, that's still very strange. That doesn't look like what a regular person's doing. And it leaves a lot of artifacts on the network, and it gives blue teamers a real head start in terms of figuring out what's going on. So the question becomes, what can we do better? Synchronous shells, these asynchronous products, this is kind of what's out there, and you really have to choose between the two. And so far, there hasn't been a lot of discussion as to alternatives to these two models when it comes to building out a C2. So,
until now, that is. So we thought, this asynchronity that we just talked about, why don't we just replace that with what we like to call asymmetry? And we're going to explain that right now. So, like we just said, the basic framework that we've been talking about, we just said it, but, again, Beacon asks, can I get a command from the C2 server? C2 server says, yeah, here you go, man. Here's a command. And the Beacon takes those results and sends it back to the same C2 server. And we see that as a sort of symmetrical setup. The Beacon, you check in with the attackers, you provide the command to run, you're seeing the data all from the same source.
Yeah. So this creates a problem because you have to use this one channel so much. You have to jump through a lot of hoops just to make the network traffic look normal and make it blend in with the day-to-day business activities. And if a blue teamer does decide to check out your C2 website, you've kind of lost at that point. These websites don't look normal. They don't have any of the affectations that a real legit site that a lot of people were using would have. So it's kind of game over the second someone decides to look into your server. Want to handle it? Okay, so we thought if there's 3 different aspects of C2 communication, why don't we split those 3 things up? We could use different websites and different services to kind of disperse our traffic and make it look a lot more normal. And we call this asymmetry because it's no longer going back and forth across a bunch of different places. And if we're going to do this, why not target the thing
most users are going to be using Windows PCs, if not all of them are going to be using Windows. So wouldn't it be cool if we could just use PowerShell to do it already built into all the machines? And for me, it's, I have mostly a software engineering background, being able to use something that can even access things like the C# library for whatever you want to use, it's pretty powerful. And we're going to get into that a little bit later.
So before we jump into the next part, we just have to say that we were asked not to mention specific services or websites that you could do this with, but instead we're just going to talk about general categories of websites and also give you some metrics and a framework for identifying new websites that we might not have thought of that can do these same things for you. So we're going to ask you to use your imagination a little bit, just so that way we don't have to drop any brand names. So the first part of the C2 cycle is obtaining commands. This is by far the easiest to do in a asymmetric, something that people are really doing anyway, right? It should be able to blend in with what an average person might do over the course of a workday. So what kind of things fit this profile? Social media, of course, jumps to mind. Almost every site nowadays allows you to have a public profile, and you can put just about whatever on it. And it would be perfectly consistent with the normal user behavior just to have a malware that goes and checks one of these social media sites and pulls down a post and uses that to as its next command.
And also thinking from a business environment, once again, a lot of these businesses use, standard communication tools, IM, to, communicate with colleagues and bosses and stuff like that. And that's also another vector that we can use for this type of implementation. You were even talking about the fact that it doesn't even need to be within just one business. Some communication softwares can actually be, what's the word, federated?
Yeah, so a lot of IM clients nowadays are federated. So although people see them as still internal messaging tools, you can actually connect them to the external world. And if you can send arbitrary messages to arbitrary people, then it makes for a great C2 channel. And one of the other things we thought about is that it doesn't need to necessarily be social media. A lot of sites nowadays are encouraging user interaction, and they have comment sections or they have dedicated forums that you can utilize and just use to make public posts that the C2 can then, or the victim can then grab.
Yeah, it's pretty flexible.
So a bit more challenging is the beaconing and returning data side, because you need a way to submit data to a website, and that's not too hard if you can use something like an API or a cookie, but the problem with that is it doesn't really scale well. Most of those things have rate limits, and if you start installing your malware across a dozen or more machines, you're going to bump into that really quickly. And so you need to kind of look for sites where you can submit data without necessarily having to log in first.
And one of the ideas we have, it's not exactly ideal, but what you could use is you can use a unique string, for instance, and put that into a post. And if you can go through each post and identify that string, you know that that's your post. You can remove the rest of the noise that's within that website.
Yeah, and so if in terms of identifying good sites and services to use for beaconing or to exfiltrate data, just think about things that are already on the machine, things that the user's probably pre-authenticated to for you, so you could leverage those just to access already, because you don't have to deal with managing a session. So in terms of sites and services, paste sites, right? I'm sure we're all familiar with different sites where you can throw a little piece of code or something, you get a unique URL, and then you can send it to all of your friends. Well, oftentimes these sites let you search it too. And so if you're putting in a unique string, right, something that really only you and the victim should know, you should be able to search through the new posts and pick out which ones are your data.
And again, we already mentioned the business-oriented IAM applications that are used by nearly everybody in corporate environments.
So you're probably wondering, is all of this hard to do, right? We're talking about all these really cool ideas, but is it something that's actually possible? And you probably think too that it would be possible if we could put a whole bunch of software and tools on a system, but that's really noisy, right? Nobody wants to leave stuff on an endpoint. And so we're telling you that idea is wrong. And I have to admit, I actually just put this slide in the presentation because I love that GIF, and I was looking for an opportunity to use it. So yeah, I really can't get enough of it.
Memes really elevate the experience, we feel.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so, here's an OPSEC-safe implementation. Like I said before, PowerShell is already on pretty much every modern Windows installation, and it is our friend. Thank you, Microsoft. For instance, a commandlet called Invoke Web Requests is basically the equivalent to curl. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but you can, make a get and post request with it. And the cool thing is that it will return you an HTML object that you can parse through. So whatever website that you want to ping with that thing, when you get it back, you can go through the HTML and find what you need pretty quickly if you know how the site is structured.
Yeah, you don't have to use awful regex, at least not too much. The other really cool commandlet that we noticed is send mail message. I think it's an incredibly powerful tool because you don't have to authenticate to it, and you can even attach files from the command line. So you can, all in one command, you can not only send an email with a body to any old person, but you can also just point out files on the hard drive, and they'll just automatically be attached. So that would be a lot more difficult without a tool like that, but PowerShell just makes it really easy, and it really opens up email as a vector for data exfiltration.
And also, it's not mentioned here, but if you needed a little bit more power, pun intended, you could, like I said, you can hook into the C# library and get crazy if you want to. You can use your imagination. There's plenty of other things that we haven't mentioned on this slide that you could try using. Go crazy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So why PowerShell? And we really make the argument for PowerShell from an OPSEC perspective, right? PowerShell is powerful, but so are many other things. But the nice thing about PowerShell is that you can really go fileless with it. And you've probably seen some techniques between using the WMI and using registry that you don't actually have to drop anything onto the system. And you can also set up events so that way you're really only operating in business hours. And that it makes things nicer because you don't have to plant additional software in order to handle those kind of aspects of it and make sure you stay clean.
So, if you wrap all these things together, what exactly do we end up with? Well, we think you end up with something that's pretty nasty. You have fileless malware that uses built-in Windows tools that's across all sort of business machines that you may be targeting. It uses standard protocols and it only communicates during business hours, so there's nothing fishy going on there, past office hours, things getting sent. And it uses common whitelisted sorry, common whitelisted websites that are also not going to look suspicious. Like it's not going to say this is a legitimate website.com/RU. It's going to be something that you know. I mean, this sounds a little bit different from your standard malware, I'd say.
Yeah, there's no files, there's almost all of the indicators and almost all the things that Defender would commonly think of when they think of identifying malware or identifying an active breach. A lot of those are missing, and that's why we think that this is a really awesome technique. So the question becomes, what can defenders do in order to counter something like that? And the answer is nothing. Red team is officially won. We can all go home, and we're done for. And Nelson's laughing at you. But for real, the first thing that really has to be done is, if a business isn't doing it already, they really need to start decrypting SSL. And I know this isn't possible in all circumstances, and HSTS is just going to make that even harder, but it's still incredibly useful. And the more attackers start to leverage these non-conventional ways of getting commands in or extrapolating data back, these aren't going to be unencrypted channels. So if you don't have any ability to decrypt SSL, then you're not going to be able to see a lot of what's going on, and it's going to make it really hard to identify.
And another thing you can do, if you're an administrator, please disable PowerShell. I mean, he has more experience than I do, but I mean, the stories he's told me of the type of people who actually have access to PowerShell. Like, I don't think a graphic designer is going to need PowerShell running on their computer. I mean, if they do, I mean, you know, walk with God. I don't know how you even be able to do that. But, I mean, and also we realize this is much easier said than done.
PowerShell can rear its ugly head in so many different ways, but even just making the attempt or trying to lock it down goes a really long way.
Yeah, I think I'd rather deal with the IT tickets of people demanding that they need PowerShell than to just leave it open for everybody and be open to these kinds of attacks.
So, in terms of like coming up with a really good solution to counter things like this, you kind of have to break out the stats textbook and start looking at anomalies from that perspective.
Machine learning.
Machine learning, exactly.
Buzzwords.
So, if you look at the network traffic over a typical day or month or year at your organization, you'll be able to get a pretty good understanding of what websites are visited and how often. So say a popular social media site is visited by at least once a day by 15% of your core user base. This is something you can monitor and track over time. And if all of a sudden there's a tremendous spike in usage of this one site, that's something that could trigger an investigation. And that's kind of the way that defenders are going to have to think in order to counter these new channels that aren't using, they're using common websites.
And, you know, we've given you the attacker's perspective and the defender's perspective, and what you end up with, as always, is the cat and mouse game. You know, attackers are always going to try to refine this implementation that we've just talked about, and we listed a few ways right here. For instance, you know, you could, if you have encrypted traffic, you can try using English words as in place of those letters. I mean, it'll look weird, but it won't get picked up immediately as something that's, well, it may get picked up eventually, but at least immediately it won't look something that's entirely suspicious.
Yeah, you know, as red teamers, we can continue to look for new sites and services that we can use and abuse in these ways. And so it's not just a matter of blocking a particular website. This is a much more systemic issue that's going to require a more concerted defense effort. And, you know, defenders, unfortunately, they're definitely on the harder side of this battle. They don't really have an option but to really just constantly be aware of what's going on in their network and to really become a purple team member. Threat hunting is the new standard, and defenders need to be looking at these different things and exploring these different kinds of metrics in order to identify what threats their network might be posed. Likewise, I feel like defenders kind of have to accept that breaches will happen, no matter how good you are, and what really makes the difference between a very successful breach or a very damaging breach and one that has minimal losses is a good IR plan. So you might not be able to counter every one of these threats, but if you have a process in place for who you call and how you handle these things, you can really minimize the loss from any one attack.
And yeah, I mean, just to wrap it up, what are the key takeaways here? So, I mean, the standard definition of a C2 right now is a bit rigorous, and we feel like that if you do something like asymmetry, you can sort of break up this definition and be a lot less detectable by sort of changing what it means to have, like, you know, a C2 server. And like we already mentioned, there's plenty of websites and servers that you can use for this implementation. And not even just websites in general. Like we said, pre-installed applications are sometimes very common across computers. And these can be used in place of the old C2 channels that we're used to.
Yeah, and we just want to say that we're not advocating for an abandonment of the old ways. Obviously, still a lot of attacks happen with the standard C2 model, and things like domain whitelisting are going to be useful for many years to come. So we're not saying abandon the old techniques, but rather that they're insufficient for new malware and for the ways that attackers are going to be moving as we go on. So defenders, we can't emphasize this enough, they really need to become threat hunters and become part of the purple team, and really, before there's a breach, doing active inspections of what kind of activities people are doing and what normal looks like. Because, of course, that's very hard for a large organization, but you need to have some sort of baseline to be able to understand these new attacks and to be able to recognize when something goes wrong. And it's a lot harder said than done. Or a lot other way around, actually. Very easy to say.
All right, and hopefully coming soon to a GitHub near you. We ran into a speed bump with this talk. We were going to show you the nitty-gritty of our implementation for something like this, but unfortunately we weren't able to do that.
Yeah. Whoa, why are you looking at me? No. Yeah, it turns out my boss is not okay with me just releasing a whole bunch of malware without getting permission first. So we're working on it. We're saying please stay in touch, because we have a lot of cool things we want to share, and we think it's useful both to red teamers for future engagements, as well as for blue teamers, just to kind of play around with their environment and to see what works. But unfortunately, we can't talk about it today. But please follow us.
And yeah, here's our some information on how to contact us. First. Sorry.
Gotta plug the brand, man. So I work for Mandiant, which is the consulting arm of FireEye, and it really is a great company to work for. And just like pretty much everyone in the space, we're growing by leaps and bounds every single quarter. So if you're interested in being a hacker and being a proactive consultant, or doing incident response, or even working on some of our products like the FireEye Helix line, we're definitely hiring, and I'd be more than happy to talk to you either now or afterwards. I should be around for the better part of today. And if you have any questions too about the kind of stuff you would need to know, or just what life is like, we'd be happy to answer that. Or also, we're both Fordham alums, so or alumni, and we would love to talk to you a bit about Fordham and the cybersecurity masters there.
Okay, and here's our contact information. So questions, comments, complaints, want to throw sandwiches at us from lunch?
Yeah. Sure. Thank you.
Who's got a question? Right here.
So I saw on one of the last slides there was mention of C2 list malware. So do you have any ideas of what kind of things you're thinking in that regard? Because I would assume that effectively everything has to communicate outbound in some capacity at some point for it to be worth it, other than short of deleting data.
Sure. So what we were talking about there in terms of C2 lists is the idea of the stereotypical C2, right? A box spun up on a cloud hosting provider with a whitelisted domain name. That idea of a C2 isn't necessarily a given if you're using these asymmetric kind of channels. So yes, there will be, if you're looking at it from a framework perspective, there will always be something that's acting in place as a C2, that's receiving data, that's sending commands, but it might not just be one server, and it might not be something that the attacker necessarily controls.
Any other questions?
So block or monitor invoke web request, and does that completely stop this, or do you have a way around that too?
So Invoke Web Request is just one way that PowerShell can communicate with a host. It makes it very easy because it has a great interface, but there's a couple different ways that you could connect to a web server with PowerShell. Also, I tend to hazard against suggesting blocking any one commandlet, because oftentimes there's another way to invoke those same commands. Like take, for example, the IEX, right? Invoke and execute. That is often like the first stage of malware being executed. It's easy to block that one, but as soon as defenders started doing that, attackers just found different ways to call the same commandlet.
Any other questions? I just wanted to ask you, can you, I saw a beacon list on there, and maybe it's kind of what you were referring to. Can you get in a little more detail about when you say beacon list? And I know you kind of, you did touch on it, but when I think of beacon lists, right, like you think of like a client calling out, you know, asking for something to do, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, we were seeing beacons as something, right, that you're gonna do every couple of seconds, that have a jitter applied to them, and you're just logging, you know, you're logging into some website and you're looking for something, and that's not necessarily what's going to happen, right? Especially if one of the things that we've been thinking about is really limiting our malware to the point of really just being a toehold most of the time. So it doesn't actually need to go get any additional commands because it has everything that we want it to do already built into it. And that's oftentimes much more effective than having to put on a much more encompassing malware that has more features and might accidentally, you know, use some software hooks that could then get picked up by different endpoint solutions.
Okay, so are you talking about like kind of pre-packaging it? So you have a very specific goal in mind. You infect the host internally, and then there's no more real communication between you and them. They just kind of know what to do, and then they send the information outbound.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the things that we were working on was the idea of using these in conjunction with a toehold malware. So it's just on there because what we see a lot of red teamers do is every computer they're interested in, they just put a beacon on it, and that becomes very noisy. So combining something that's more of like a toehold, and you can get whatever data, whether it be Mimikatz or something like that, off of the system, and then you have something on there should you want to escalate up to something like a full beacon session, but it's not necessarily doing anything in the meanwhile, it's just waiting to be activated. So beaconless in that sense.
Okay. So just rounding it back out, so say you did want to escalate or you know, do more on there or turn it into a full-blown beacon, how would you, if it's not communicating out, then how would you then kind of get that, how would you enable that or get that working?
So it could be as simple as assuming that you still had code execution within the environment, you can use WMI remotely, right? You could change a system parameter or something, which could then invoke the rest of the malware to go and download like a full beacon from a different place. So I guess if you wanted to be very precise, you could consider a beacon to be something internal to a system, right? Checking a system setting or checking a registry key, but so we always see beacons as something that's going across the network. So that's an assumption that defenders really can't make, we feel.
Okay. Any other questions, guys? Thank you. Up front.
Are you seeing a lot of malware in the wild that's using these techniques?
So the closest thing we've seen is there's actually a paper on it by FireEye. It's called Hammer Toss. It was attributed, I believe, to Russian actors, and it used social media as a C2. And that was kind of the impetus for this, is we thought, wow, you know, how can we extend something like that? What's the future, right? If we know that attackers are already looking at these third-party services as ways to deliver malware or to stage things, what's going to be next? And we thought that this kind of asymmetric model is what we're seeing a shift to. But yeah, this is still very much early, and we haven't seen a lot of examples of this yet.
Any other questions, guys?
So I was just wondering what, if any, thoughts you had on like the strengths and advantages of this approach versus maybe something like domain fronting or something for communication. Thanks.
Sure. So yeah, domain fronting is definitely a hot topic now, and I've used it with some mixed success, but ultimately, oftentimes it can be defeated by SSL decryption, right? Because you're going to look at something, you know, being connected to a host, and there's a different host header. It's definitely harder to do, and maybe not practical in all circumstances, but I feel like it is recognizable. Not to mention, I feel like a lot of common targets that people use when they're doing domain fronting, from my understanding, they don't particularly like being used in this way, and they're certainly looking to kind of stop that. So, not to mention, there's also problems I've seen with like caching, and even if you turn caching off on these different frontings, sometimes bad things still happen, and it's not a very consistent channel.
And just to add to that, because I'm kind of familiar with this area, Palo Alto, one of their new OS releases, does have the, if you do SSL or TLS decryption, it does have the ability to detect, domain fronting.
Yeah.
So I imagine you're testing these techniques in live, but you're also testing the statistical approaches for detecting them. Can you give us a sense of what levels of success you're getting on the detection side?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So you mentioned that you're working on some machine learning AI-based approaches to detecting this. Could you give us a sense of what levels of success you're seeing in detecting these sorts of this sort of C2 traffic?
So we both love making models, and we're exploring a lot of things in this area, but we don't really have anything yet, especially in terms of a final product or a final model. So yeah, this is although I anticipate, because our research is in a similar area in terms of machine learning. So I imagine that you are going to have a real problem. Anytime you're doing anomaly detection with machine learning, it becomes a real class imbalance problem. So yeah, we're far from suggesting that a solution like that is easy. But we just saw the basic anomaly detection using a normal distribution, some p-values, is something that is possible if you have a good SIM and some good logs.
Thank you.
Any questions, guys? No? All right. Everybody, please give Anthony and Andrew a nice warm round of applause. And then, as you guys know,